Morgan Black had been a park ranger for 10 years, and the Cathedral Peak wilderness in the Sierra Nevadas was her domain. Every trail marker, every switchback, every hidden meadow burned into her memory through hundreds of patrols. The kind of knowledge that came from walking the same ground until your feet knew the terrain better than any map ever could. She'd volunteer for this 5-day solo patrol without hesitation, needing the solitude after the divorce finalized 3 months ago, needing the silence of the high country, where the only voice she had to listen to was her own, and even that she could ignore she chose. The first day passed exactly as expected. She logged the trailhead at Cathedral Lake at 0800 hours, hiked the standard Eastern Circuit check-in campsites for bear activity and trail conditions, made notes about a fallen pine blocking the path to Lower Echo Lake that would need clearing, and set up camp at her usual spot near Crescent Meadow as the sun dropped behind the granite peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that she'd seen 1,000 times but never tired of watching. She ate her freeze-dried dinner, updated her log, checked her radio, clear signal back to headquarters, everything nominal, and fell asleep to familiar sounds of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a great horned owl, comfortable in the knowledge that tomorrow will be the same as today, and the day after that, the pattern she'd followed for a decade, holding steady like the mountains themselves. She woke with the sun on day 2, brewed coffee over her camp stove, broke down her tent with practice efficiency, and started north on the trail toward Twin Lakes. And that's when she noticed the first thing wrong. The trail marker at the edge of Crescent Meadow, the one she'd passed 1,000 times, a weathered wooden post with yellow blaze marking the route north, was on the wrong side of the path. She stopped, staring at it, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew. The marker had always been on the west side of the trail. She was certain of it. She'd used it as a reference point for years, but there it stood on the east side, exactly where it shouldn't be. Vandalism. She thought some hiker had pulled it up and replanted it incorrectly. It happened sometimes, people thinking they were being helpful, and she made a mental note to file a report and continued hiking. But 20 minutes later she found a cairn, a stack of stones marking a path junction, sitting in a location where no cairn had ever existed, and she knew every cairn in this section of wilderness, had memorized them all because they were crucial navigation aids, and this one was new, or old or something. The stones weathered and lichen covered like they'd been there for decades, but they hadn't. She knew they hadn't. By noon, her unease had crystallized into something sharper when she checked her GPS and saw coordinates that made no sense. According to the device, she was standing 300 yards west of where the trail actually ran, but she was on the trail. She could see it beneath her feet, could see the worn earth and the boot prints from previous hikers, but the GPS insisted she was somewhere else entirely. She pulled out her topographic map, triangulated her position using visible landmarks, that distinctive granite outcropping to the east, the line of aspens marking the creek drainage to the north, and confirmed she was exactly where she thought she was. But the GPS disagreed, and when she looked up from the map to double-check the granite outcropping, it seemed farther away than it should be, or maybe closer, the perspective wrong, in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The meadow she reached at 1,400 hours was wrong too, or rather, it was right but displaced. She knew this meadow, had eaten lunch here dozens of times, but it should have been another quarter-mile north. Yet here it was unmistakable in its features, the same wildflowers, the same lightning-struck pine at the western edge, but in the wrong location, and the creek that fed it was flowing backward, south to north instead of north to south, water moving uphill in defiance of gravity and basic physics. She tried her radio then, fingers trembling slightly as she keyed the mic. Headquarters, this is Ranger Black on Cathedral Peak Patrol. Do you copy? Static answered her, thick and crackling, and beneath it she heard something else, her own voice, faint and distorted, saying words she hadn't spoken. Don't trust the trails. Don't follow the patterns it's learning. And then the transmission cut to pure static, and when she released a key and tried again, there was nothing, just dead air, not even static. as the radio had stopped working entirely, though the battery indicators showed full charge and all the lights were functioning normally. The rational part of her brain, the part trained in wilderness safety and emergency protocols, told her to turn back immediately, to retrace her route to the trailhead and get out of the backcountry. But when she turned around and started walking south on the same trail she'd hiked that morning, she found it had changed. The fallen pine she'd noted near Lower Echo Lake was gone, the trail it had blocked now clear, and showing no evidence of recent obstruction, no sawdust, no drag marks, nothing to suggest a tree had ever fallen there, and the aspens she'd passed 3 hours earlier were in different positions, the distinctive white bark catching afternoon sun from angles that didn't match her memory. She walked for 2 hours, checking her compass obsessively, and the needle spun lazily, never quite settling on magnetic north, drifting between headings like it couldn't decide which direction was real. And when she finally stopped to catch her breath and get her bearings, she realized she was back at Crescent Meadow, the same meadow where she'd camped the night before, though she'd been walking directly away from it for 2 hours and should have been miles to the south. The sun was dropping toward the horizon now, the sky bleeding orange and red, and she had no choice but to make camp again, her hands shaking as she pitched her tent in almost the exact spot where she slept the night before, the coincidence too perfect to be anything but impossible. She forced herself to eat, to go through her normal evening routine, to act like everything was fine, like the world hadn't started breaking its own rules. And as darkness fell, she lay in her sleeping bag with her headlamp on, listening to the forest and trying to convince herself that tomorrow everything would make sense, that she'd wake up and the trails would be where they belonged and her GPS would work, and she'd hike out and file a report about equipment malfunction and stress-induced disorientation, and maybe she'd take some leave time, see a therapist about the divorce and the isolation, and whatever was making her perceive these impossible things. Around midnight, she woke to breathing, heavy and rhythmic, the sound of something large moving around her tent in slow, deliberate circles, and she froze in her sleeping bag, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe, listening to footsteps crunching through pine needles and undergrowth, one circuit around a tent, then another, then a third, whatever was taking its time, and she could hear it sniffing at the tent fabric, could hear the wet sound of its breath, and after an eternity, she found the courage to reach for her flashlight and shine it through the tent mesh toward the sound, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice. Footprints in the dirt, clearly visible in the beam of her light, boot prints with a distinctive tread pattern of her own hiking boots, fresh impressions in the dust leading in a circle around her tent, but the prints were coming to the tent from the outside, approaching from the woods, and she'd been inside the tent for hours, hadn't stepped. Outside since crawling into her sleeping bag at 2,100 hours, which meant something else had made those prints. Something wearing boots with her exact tread pattern. Something that had circled her tent 3 times while she slept. The breathing stopped the moment her light hit the ground, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound had been, a complete absence of noise that felt unnatural in the forest night. No wind, no insects, no distant owl calls. Just dead silence pressing against her eardrums like water pressure, and she lay there with her light still shining through the mesh, watching the footprints, watching the darkness beyond them, waiting for whatever had made them to come back. But nothing moved, nothing breathed, and eventually her flashlight battery died and plunged her into absolute darkness. And she didn't sleep at all, just lay there listening to the silence and feeling the mountains holding their breath around her, waiting for dawn like a prisoner waiting for reprieve. When the sun finally rose and light leaked through the tent fabric, she emerged on shaking legs and looked around her campsite with exhausted eyes, and the footprints were still there, circling the tent in 3 perfect loops, and she followed with her gaze to where they emerged from the tree line, and there at the edge of the woods were more prints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all with her tread pattern, crisscrossing and overlapping like an army of Morgans had gathered in the night. To watch her sleep, she broke camp in record time, stuffing gear into her pack without bothering to organize it properly, and started hiking with no clear destination, just moving, needing to move, and after 4 hours of walking she crested a ridge and saw it. The ranger station, her station, the building that should have been 15 miles to the southeast, sitting in a valley directly ahead of her, but something was wrong with it. The structure looked old, abandoned, windows dark and shattered. The parking area, empty and overgrown with weeds that had pushed up through cracked asphalt. And she knew with absolute certainty that she'd been here 3 days ago for shift change, and it had been pristine and functional and full of her colleagues. But now it looked like it had been abandoned for decades. She approached slowly, each step feeling like a betrayal of reason, and when she reached the door she found it unlocked, swinging open on hinges that screamed with rust, and inside the air smelled of dust and rotten time, everything covered in thick layers of gray powder, and she moved to the familiar rooms like a ghost haunting her own life, seeing her desk, her filing cabinets, her coffee mug still sitting where she'd left it but coated in grime, and she walked to the locker room on legs that felt disconnected from her body, found her locker, the one with her name stenciled on it in neat black letters, and opened it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and there inside, hanging on the hook where she'd left her spare uniform, was her ranger jacket and pants, but they were destroyed, covered in dark stains that could only be dried blood, deep claw marks torn to the fabric from shoulder to hem, the kind of damage that suggested whatever had been wearing this uniform when it was attacked hadn't survived the encounter. And as she stood there staring at her own ruined clothes, smelling the old copper scent of blood mixed with dust and decay, she heard a sound from somewhere deeper in the station. Footsteps on the stairs leading to the second floor, slow and deliberate, and a voice that might have been her own calling out from the darkness above. "Morgan, is it you down there? I've been waiting for you to come back." Morgan stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the darkness of the second floor, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and the voice called out again, clearer this time, unmistakably her own voice, but wrong somehow, the cadence off, the tone too flat. "Morgan, I know you can hear me. I've been waiting so long. Please come up. We need to talk about what's happening to us." And every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of this abandoned station and never look back. But she needed to understand, needed to know what was calling to her in her own voice. So she pulled her flashlight from her belt with a trembling hand and started climbing the stairs, each step creaking under her weight, dust motes swirling in the beam of light. And when she reached the top, she found herself in a hallway she knew well, had walked countless times. But the doors were all open now, rooms she'd never been allowed to enter, because they were always locked, marked as storage or off-limits. And from a room at the end of the hall came a faint glow, flickering like candlelight, and she moved toward it because she had no other choice, because turning back meant accepting she'd never understand. And when she pushed the door fully open, she found herself in a space that shouldn't exist. The room was large, much larger than the building's exterior dimensions should allow, and every wall was covered with maps, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all showing the Cathedral Peak wilderness area, but each one slightly different from the others. Landmarks shifted, trails running in impossible directions, terrain features that didn't match reality. Some maps showing lakes where there should be forest, others showing mountains where valleys belonged, and in the center of the room was a bulletin board covered with more maps, these ones marked with red routes that crisscrossed and overlapped. And when she stepped closer and looked at the pattern they formed, she could see they spelled out words. "Don't trust the trails," in letters made of hiking paths that didn't exist on any official map. She heard the footsteps, then heavy boots on the floorboard behind her. Coming up the stairs she just climbed, the same deliberate pace as whatever had circled her tent, and she spun around with her flashlight raised like a weapon, but the hallway was empty, just dust and shadows, though the footsteps continued. Getting closer, the sound coming from the stairs, but nothing visible making it, and she backed into the map room and slammed the door, her breath coming in short gasps and through. The thin which she heard the footsteps reach the top of the stairs, pause, then start down the hallway toward her. Each impact to boot on floor perfectly measured, perfectly timed, and they stopped right outside the door, and in the silence that followed she could hear breathing, slow and steady, and she pressed her back against the far wall. Flashlight trained on the door, waiting for it to open, but it didn't. The breathing just continued, in and out, and then it stopped and the footsteps retreated back down the hallway, back down the stairs, and she was alone again with the maps and her racing heart. She spent the next hour examining the maps more carefully, looking for patterns, for explanations, and she noticed dates written in corners, some from the 1970s, others from the 90s, a few from the 2000s, and several from recent years, including one dated just 2 months ago, and each map showed a progression, the territory changing slightly from one version to the next, trails shifting position, landmarks moving, as if the wilderness itself was evolving, learning, adapting over time. In the corner of the room, she found a filing cabinet, drawers hanging open, and inside were folders full of incident reports, disappearances dating back to 1962, each one following a similar pattern. Experienced hiker or ranger, knew the area well, vanished during routine activity, never found. Search teams reported equipment malfunctions and terrain that didn't match official maps. And she counted 23 separate incidents over 6 decades, 23 people who'd walked into these woods and never walked out. On the desk, she found a journal, leather-bound and worn, and when she opened it, she recognized her own handwriting immediately, neat and precise, the way she'd been trained to document everything in her ranger logs. And the first entry was dated 47 days from now, which was impossible because that date hadn't happened yet. But there it was in her handwriting. Day 47. I've stopped trying to count the iterations, stopped trying to map the changes. The territory shifts faster than I can. Track it now. And I think it's because it's learning from me, absorbing my knowledge of the trails and using it against me. I found another version of myself today. She was wearing my uniform, but it was torn and bloody. She ran when she saw me, didn't even try to speak, just ran like I was a threat, and maybe I am. Maybe we're all threats to each other now, all the Morgans scattered through this place, all trying to survive, all feeding the thing that's learning to be us. She flipped through the pages, reading entries that documented experiences she hadn't had yet, but recognized from the past few days. The wrong trail markers, the GPS failures, the footprints around a tent, the abandoned station, and the journal described them in perfect detail, as if she'd already lived through them and written them down. And near the end of the journal, in an entry dated weeks from now, she read, "It's learning my patterns. It knows how I think, knows where I'll go before I go there. Today I saw myself in the woods. She looked at me and ran. I don't think she was real. I don't think I'm real anymore. We're all just echoes of the person who first got lost here. Copies degrading with each iteration." She dropped the journal like it had burned her, backed away from the desk, and that's when she noticed the photographs pinned to a corkboard on the wall. Dozens of them, all showing her, Morgan Black, but in different contexts, different times. Morgan sitting at the desk downstairs, Morgan hiking a trail, Morgan making camp, and the photographs were old, the colors faded, the paper yellowed with age, some of them looking like they'd been taken decades ago. But she was in them, unmistakably her, wearing ranger uniforms from different eras. Her face unchanged, but the clothing and equipment dating the images to times before she was born. She fled the room then, couldn't stand to be surrounded by evidence of her own impossible existence across multiple timelines, and she ran down the stairs and out of the station, into the late afternoon sunlight that felt thin and wrong, and she started walking with no destination in mind, just needing to move, to feel her legs working and her lungs breathing and her heart pumping, to feel alive and real and singular, not scattered across time like the photograph suggested. She found the first campsite an hour later, tucked into a grove of pines, and she recognized her own gear immediately. The same brand of tent, same color sleeping bag, Same cooking setup she carried, but the equipment was degraded. Tent fabric sun-bleached and torn. Sleeping bag with the stuffing coming out through rips in the nylon. Pots and pans rusted and pitted, and in the fire ring were ashes that might have been a week old or a year old. Impossible to tell, and when she searched the site more thoroughly, she found her water bottle, bright orange Nalgene with M. Black written in permanent marker on the side, but the plastic was cracked and clouded with age, and when she picked it up it crumbled to her hands. The second campsite was different, fresh, recently used, ashes in the fire ring still warm to the touch, and here she found the same orange Nalgene bottle with her name on it, but this one was pristine new, still half full of water that was clear and cold, and she stood there holding fragments of one bottle, while looking at its twin, understanding that she wasn't just experiencing the territory at different times, she was experiencing different versions of herself at different points in the same impossible timeline, past and future, and present all layered on top of each other. She found 5 more campsites before darkness fell, each one showing evidence of her presence, her gear, her methods, her habits, but in various states of decay or preservation, and she began to see the pattern. The territory wasn't just changing the landscape. It was cycling through different states, different moments, and she was encountering evidence of herself at multiple points in those cycles, like walking through a forest of mirrors that reflected not just her appearance but her entire timeline. Every moment she'd been lost here or would be lost here, all existing simultaneously. As night approached, she climbed a rocky outcrop to get her bearings, needing the elevation to see the bigger picture, and from the summit she looked out over the darkening forest and saw lights moving below, multiple lights spread across the valley, 5 or 6 of them at least, all moving in patterns she recognized because they were her patterns, the standard patrol route she'd walked for 10 years, the circuit she knew by heart, and she realized with cold certainty that the lights were following her movements, mimicking her behavior, learning her routes by copying them, and whatever was carrying those lights was studying her, absorbing her knowledge, becoming her in increments. She watched when the lights break away from its patrol route and start moving toward her position, ascending the trail that led to the outcrop, and she considered hiding, considered running, but instead she stayed where she was, needed to see what was coming, needed to know what wore her face and carried her light, and as the figure climbed closer, she could make out details in the moonlight. Range of uniform, familiar build and posture, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew these trails intimately, and when the figure was 50 yards away, she could see the face clearly, and it was hers, exactly hers, same features, same hair pulled back in the same ponytail, and the duplicate hadn't noticed her yet, was just walking the trail with purpose, flashlight sweeping ground ahead, and Morgan held her breath and stayed absolutely still, pressed against a boulder, and the duplicate walked past her hiding spot, close enough that Morgan could have reached out and touched her, and she saw details that made her stomach turn. Scratches on the duplicate's face, uniform torn and dirty, a haunted look in the eyes that suggested this version had been out here for a long time, and as the duplicate passed, she turned her head and looked directly at Morgan, made eye contact for one eternal second, and her expression shifted from confusion to terror, and she whispered urgently, "Run! It's learning our patterns. It knows where we go. You have to break the routine or it'll catch." "You like it caught me." And then the duplicate turned and sprinted back down the trail, boots pounding on stone, flashlight beam bobbing wildly, and Morgan watched her go, watched herself flee in panic, and she understood that the duplicate had been trying to warn her that somewhere in this twisted timeline another Morgan had learned something crucial about survival and was trying to pass that knowledge back. But the warning raised more questions than it answered. What patterns, what routine, what was learning? And how did you break a pattern when the thing hunting you had already absorbed everything you knew about these woods? Morgan spent the night on the outcrop, unwilling to descend into the dark woods where light still moved in patrol patterns, mimicking routines she perfected over a decade, and she sat with her back against cold stone, fighting exhaustion, knowing that sleep meant vulnerability, meant becoming prey to whatever was learning to wear her face. And every time her eyes started to close, she forced them open again, focused on the stars above that seemed too bright, too close, as if the sky itself had shifted closer to Earth in this place where normal rules didn't apply. Dawn came slowly, light creeping across the valley in shades of gray and gold. And when she finally stood, her legs were stiff and protesting, her body demanding rest she couldn't afford to give it, and she started down the opposite side of the outcrop, choosing a route she'd never taken before, avoiding the established trails, pushing through underbrush and scrambling over fallen logs, trying to be unpredictable, trying to break the patterns the duplicate had warned her about. She'd been moving for maybe an hour when she came to a ridge she knew, had hiked dozens of times, a narrow spine of granite with spectacular views of the valley below, and she started to cross it carefully, testing each foothold, aware that a fall here meant serious injury or death. But halfway across she heard a sound that stopped her cold, a crack, sharp and final, like breaking bone, and the trail section behind her collapsed, simply gave way and tumbled into darkness, rock and earth cascading, down into a void that shouldn't exist. She turned slowly, carefully maintaining her balance on the remaining section of trail, and looked back at where she just walked, and instead of the familiar ridge continuing behind her, there was now a chasm, a vertical drop that plunged at least 500 feet straight down into blackness. And the geological surveys she'd studied, the topographic maps she'd memorized, all insisted this chasm didn't exist, couldn't exist. The terrain here was supposed to be solid granite, extending for miles. She stood there frozen, caught between the impossibility behind her and the unknown ahead, and that's when she saw movement in the chasm, something climbing up from the depths, and she trained her flashlight on it, even though the morning sun was already brightening the sky, needing the focus beam to make sense of what she was seeing. The creature ascending the cliff face was wrong in ways that made her brain hurt to process. It moved on limbs that bent in too many places, joints that flexed backward and forward and sideways, defying the basic architecture of vertebrate anatomy, and its body was shadow black, seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, and as it climbed it shifted between forms, sometimes pulling itself up on what looked like arms, sometimes using legs, sometimes moving with an insect-like fluidity that suggested it had more than 4 limbs, the count changing as she watched. It was roughly human-sized, but the proportions were all wrong, too tall when it stood upright, too long when it stretched in the head, if that's what the dark mass at the top could be called, swiveled on a neck that rotated too far, a complete 180 that no human spine could manage, and it seemed to be looking at her even though she couldn't make out eyes or features, just darkness shaped into something approximating a face. She ran then, pure animal panic overriding thought, and she sprinted along the remaining section of ridge trail with no concern for safety, just desperate speed. And behind her she could hear it, the sound of something massive moving across stone, the scrape of limbs finding purchase, the wet sound of breathing that echoed wrong in the morning air, and she didn't look back, just ran until the ridge widened into a slope, and she could plunge into the tree cover, branches whipping at her face and arms, her pack slamming against her back with each stride. She ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, ran until the sound of pursuit faded behind her, and when she finally stopped, doubling over with hands on her knees, gasping for air, she found herself in unfamiliar territory, a section of forest she didn't recognize despite her years of experience, trees spaced in patterns that seemed wrong, undergrowth too thick in some places and absent in others, and when she checked her compass, the needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on any direction. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think, and she realized that running had been predictable, had been what the creature expected because it knew her patterns, and by running she just confirmed its model of her behavior was accurate. She needed to do something it wouldn't predict, something that violated her training and instincts, so instead of continuing to flee, she found a massive fallen log, ancient and half-rotted, and she crawled underneath it, wedging herself into the narrow gap between a log and the ground, pulling her pack in behind her, and she lay there in the dirt and decomposing wood, in absolute darkness that smelled of earth and decay, and she waited. The sounds came eventually, heavy footfalls moving to the forest, irregular and searching, and she heard it passing nearby, circling her general area, and then the footsteps stopped, replaced by silence so complete it felt like pressure against her eardrums, and in that silence she heard breathing, close and wet, the sound of lungs working, and she realized it was right above her, standing on or near the log, and she held her own breath, didn't move a muscle, didn't blink, just lay there, in the dark like a corpse, and prayed it would move on. Then it spoke, and the voice it used was hers, exactly hers, the same pitch and tone and cadence she heard on recordings of herself. Morgan Black, Ranger Station, Cathedral Peak Wilderness, Morgan. And it was cycling through phrases like computer learning language, testing syllables and inflections, and the rawness of hearing her own voice coming from that thing above her made her skin crawl, made her want to scream, but she stayed silent and still. The voice continued, running through more phrases, some of them things she'd said recently. Headquarters, this is Ranger Black, need to get back to base, something's wrong with the terrain, and others that sounded like they came from further back in her memory, casual conversations with colleagues, radio check-ins, even fragment of arguments with her ex-husband, and she understood that it had access to everything, every word she'd spoken in these woods over the years, every interaction it had observed or absorbed from previous versions of her, and it was practicing, refining, learning to be her one syllable at a time. Through a gap in the log, she could see its legs now, illuminated by the morning sun filtering to the canopy, and they were impossibly wrong, bending backward at what should have been the knee, then forward again at another joint lower down, then backward at a third articulation near the foot. Too many segments in the limbs, and the feet themselves weren't feet at all, but something more like hands, long digits splayed out for grip, each one ending in what looked like a curved talon or claw. The creature shifted its weight, and she heard the wood creak above her, and one of those hand feet came down right next to the gap where she was hiding, close enough that she could see the texture of the skin. If it was skin, a surface that looked more like shadow given physical form. Darkness made solid, and she noticed it was learning even now, the joints adjusting slightly, the angle of articulation changing as it tested different configurations, try and find the most efficient way to move through this terrain. After an eternity, it moved away, the footsteps resuming, heading north, and she waited in her hiding spot until sounds faded completely, until she couldn't hear anything but normal forest noise, birds calling, wind through branches, the distant rush of a creek, and only then did she carefully, slowly, quietly extract herself from beneath the log, emerging into daylight that felt thin and insufficient after the absolute darkness. She was covered in dirt and rotted wood, her hands shaking, and she allowed herself 30 seconds to process the terror before forcing herself to move, to think tactically. The duplicate's warning echoed in her mind. Break the patterns, and she understood now. Every decision based on her training fed the creature's understanding, gave it more data, made its mimicry more accurate, and the only way to stay ahead was to become unpredictable, to violate every principle of wilderness survival she'd ever learned. She spent the afternoon moving erratically, deliberately choosing poor routes, camping in exposed locations, eating at irregular intervals, and it felt wrong, felt like courting disaster, but she understood that vulnerability to natural dangers was preferable to predictability to an unnatural predator. As evening approached, she found herself in a meadow she half recognized, the same one she'd noted on day 2 with its backward-flowing creek, and in the fading light she saw something that made her stop. A circle of stones in the center of the meadow, deliberately arranged, and inside the circle were objects, dozens of them. And when she approached carefully, every sense alert for threats, she saw they were artifacts from the disappeared, ranger badges from different decades, rotted backpacks, with unfamiliar names stenciled on them, a radio that looked like it was from the 1970s based on its design, modern GPS units with cracked screens, boots in various states of decay, even a leather jacket with a Park Service patch from the 1960s. This was a collection, she realized, a gathering place for remnants of everyone who'd been taken, and she counted the badges, 12 of them, ranging from tarnished brass to modern plastic, and she thought about the 23 incident reports she'd seen in the filing cabinet, and she wondered where the other 11 badges were, whether those rangers had escaped or whether the collection was incomplete, still being added to one piece at a time. In the center of the circle, half buried in the earth, she found her own badge, the one that should have been on her uniform, but when she checked her chest it was missing, and she had no memory of losing it. But there it was in the dirt, already tarnishing despite being days old at most, and she understood that time worked differently here, that objects could age years and hours. She heard voices then, multiple voices, all female, all hers, and she turned to see them emerging from the tree line, for versions of herself, all wearing ranger uniforms in different states of damage, and they moved in perfect synchronization, their steps aligned, heads turning in unison to look at her, and the coordination was too perfect, too precise, too inhuman in its exactness, and she knew these weren't duplicates like the one who'd warned her. These were something the territory had, made copies too perfect to be real, and they advanced with mechanical precision, and she ran, fled across the meadow toward the opposite tree line, and behind her came 4 sets of footsteps in perfect rhythm, 4 voices calling her name in perfect harmony, offering help and safety if she would only stop and join them, and the sound was worse than the creature's rasping breath, worse than anything she'd experienced, because it was her voice multiplied and merged into something that had never been human, just a perfect imitation, with nothing real behind it, and she ran until her body gave out, and she collapsed at the base of an enormous pine tree, ancient and gnarled, and the pursuing voices stopped abruptly, as if they'd hit an invisible wall, and when she looked back she saw the 4 duplicates standing at the meadow's edge, perfectly still, perfectly synchronized, watching but not approaching, and she realized she'd stumbled into some kind of safe zone, a boundary they couldn't cross, and she pressed her back against the rough bark and let herself breathe, let herself rest, even as she wondered what made the spot different and how long protection would last. Morgan woke to gray dawn light filtering through pine needles, her body aching from sleeping on hard ground against the ancient tree, and for a moment she let herself believe it had all been a nightmare, that she'd wake up in her normal campsite with a normal day of patrol ahead. But then she saw the meadow beyond the tree line, and the 4 duplicates still standing there, motionless as statues, perfectly synchronized even in their stillness. And she knew the nightmare was continuing. She spent the morning exploring the area around the enormous pine, testing the boundaries of what seemed to be a protected zone, and she found that the safety extended roughly 30 yards in all directions from the tree's massive trunk, a circular area where the duplicates wouldn't enter and where the forest felt somehow more real, more stable, less prone to the shifting wrongness that characterized the rest of the territory. She noticed something else, too. Carved into the trunk of the ancient pine were names and dates, dozens of them, some so old the bark had partially grown over them, and she recognized the pattern from the collection in the meadow. These were markers left by others who'd been trapped here, people who'd found the sanctuary and documented their time. Samuel Torres, 1923 to 40 days. Jennifer Wu, 1987 to 12 days. Marcus Bell, 2003 to 89 days. Each one a testament to survival and eventual disappearance. Near the bottom of the trunk at eye level, she found a recent carving. Morgan Black, 2024, Day 1. The letters fresh and deep, and she hadn't carved this, had never touched this tree before yesterday, which meant another version of her had been here, had marked the beginning of her captivity. And she wondered if that Morgan was still out there somewhere, another iteration lost in the layered timelines. She returned to the abandoned ranger station, moving carefully, watching for signs of the creature or the duplicates, and she made her way back to the office where she'd found the journal and the maps, and she spent hours reading through the incident reports more carefully, looking for patterns, for clues, for anything that might explain what was happening and how to escape it. The reports went back to 1962, shortly after a construction project had disturbed what was described in survey documents as an archaeological site of unknown origin, stone structures that predated known Native American settlement in the region, and the first disappearance happened 3 weeks after the site was excavated and several artifacts were removed to a museum in Sacramento. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its consistency. The territory would claim someone every few years, always experienced outdoors people, always people who knew the area well, and search teams would report strange phenomena, GPS malfunctions, terrain that didn't match maps, time discrepancies where rescuers would swear they'd been searching for hours, but their watches showed only minutes had passed. Some reports mentioned finding the missing person's gear arranged in impossible ways, as if someone had been practicing setting up camp, and one report from 1978 described finding a hiker's journal that documented 63 days of being lost, even though the hiker had only been missing for 4 days, according to the official timeline. She found a folder marked confidential, not for public record, and inside were testimonies from the few people who'd escaped, though escape seemed like the wrong word because their accounts suggested they'd been released rather than freed themselves. A ranger named Sarah Matheson, who'd gone missing in 1995 for 3 weeks, described experiencing multiple versions of the same day. Like the forest was stuck in a loop, and I kept finding my own campsites, but they were in different states of decay, some fresh and some ancient. And at night, I could hear things moving through the trees that sounded like me, using my voice, calling my name. And when I finally made it out, I couldn't remember how. Just that one morning I woke up in the trails. We're normal again, and I walked out in 6 hours, even though I'd been trying to find my way out for weeks. A firefighter named David Reyes, missing for 9 days in 2008, reported similar experiences and added, "It felt like the forest was learning from me, watching how I moved, where I camped, what I ate, and near the end I started seeing myself, other versions of me in different stages of the same journey, and they all looked terrified, and one of them told me I had to break my patterns, stop doing things the way I'd been trained, and that's when things started to change, when I started making choices that didn't make sense." Morgan understood now what she was dealing with. The territory wasn't just a place. It was alive in some sense, or inhabited by something alive, and had been feeding on lost people for decades, absorbing their knowledge and patterns and memories, learning what it meant to be human by consuming human consciousness. And the duplicates she'd seen were its attempts to recreate what it had absorbed, getting better with each iteration, refining its mimicry. She found a geological survey from the original excavation in 1962 and described the stone structures as anomalous, showing no signs of weathering despite appearing ancient, arranged in a circular pattern with a central chamber containing a carved stone of unknown composition that registers unusual electromagnetic readings. And there was a notation that the stone had been removed to the museum, but then returned to the site 3 months later after persistent equipment failures and unexplained phenomena at the museum, including reports from security guards who claimed to hear voices in empty halls and see shadows moving through exhibits after hours, and one incident where 3 different people reported seeing the same woman in ranger uniform walking through the building even though the museum was closed and locked, as if the stone needed to be in its original location, as if removing it had consequences that rippled beyond simple equipment malfunction, and returning it hadn't fixed what had been broken, had only changed how the wrongness manifested. Morgan pulled out her own map and compared it to the survey documents, tried to pinpoint the exact location of the disturbed site, and after cross-referencing landmarks and terrain features, she found it. A valley approximately 4 miles south-southwest of her current position, in an area marked as restricted on modern maps, though the restriction notice gave no reason beyond geological instability. She spent the afternoon planning, knowing that she needed to reach that site, that the core of whatever was happening would be there, but also knowing that the direct route will be predictable, that the territory would expect her to head straight for it. So she plotted an indirect path that violated basic navigation logic, a route that would take her through difficult terrain, that would double back on itself, that would make no sense to anyone tracking her movements. As darkness fell, she left the safety of the ancient pine, moving quietly through the forest, and she saw lights in the distance, patrol patterns, but they seemed fewer now, more concentrated in specific areas, and she wondered if the territory was learning to anticipate her movements or if it was conserving resources, focusing its attention on the most likely paths. She traveled through the night, moving without a light, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks but refusing to slow down, pushing through underbrush that tore at her uniform and scratched her face, crossing streams by feel alone, climbing over fallen logs that she couldn't see until she was right on top of them, and several times she fell, going down hard on her knees or palms. But each time she got back up and kept moving, driven by the understanding that stopping meant capture, meant becoming another echo absorbed into the territory's growing knowledge. And by dawn, she'd covered maybe 2 miles in a direction that would eventually lead toward a restricted valley, but via a circuitous route that took her through areas she'd never patrolled, where patterns wouldn't be established, where the territory would have no historical data about her movements to draw from. She found herself in a rocky area, boulder fields and scree slopes, terrain that was difficult and dangerous, but that also provided good visibility, and she scrambled up to a high point to survey the landscape, and what she saw made her stop breathing for a moment. The valley below was fracturing, glitching, the terrain visibly shifting, trees phasing in and out of existence, rock formations that looked like they belonged to different geological eras, appearing and disappearing, and at the center of the valley was a clearing with stone ruins barely visible through distortion, and she knew with absolute certainty that those ruins were the site, the place where it all started, where the territory was anchored to reality. She was planning her descent when she heard movement behind her and turned to find another version of herself standing 10 feet away. But this one was different from all the others. Gaunt and feral-looking, covered in scars both old and fresh, uniform torn and filthy and stained with what looked like old blood, carrying a knife in one hand with the blade darkened by rust or worse, and wearing an expression of desperate determination, mixed with something that looked like relief, as if she'd been searching for this moment, for this meeting, for a long time. The Pharaoh Morgan spoke, voice hoarse. "Day 47. You're on day 3 or 4, I think. I can tell by how clean you still look, how you're still trying to make sense of it all. But listen to me carefully, because I don't have much time before Find Me again. You need to get to the center of those ruins, to the stone. That's where it lives, where it's anchored, and it can't let you reach it because that's its only vulnerability. It'll throw everything at you, every version of us it's absorbed, every trick it's learned. But if you can touch the stone while it's trying to stop you, you can push back, you can flood it with something it can't process. You can break its ability to learn and copy and absorb." Morgan started to ask questions, but Pharaoh Morgan held up a hand. "No time. It's already coming. I'm going to create a distraction, but you have to run when I tell you to. You have to get down into that valley and reach the ruins no matter what you see or hear. Don't trust anything. Don't stop for anyone, not even me, especially not me, because there are dozens of us now, all scattered through the timeline, and most of us aren't real anymore. We're just echoes it's using to learn to perfect the copy." She whistled then, sharp and piercing, and from the rocks around them emerged more feral versions, more scarred and damaged iterations of Morgan Black, at least 8 of them, and they all looked at her with recognition and something like pity, and Pharaoh Morgan grabbed her shoulders. "Day 1 Morgan, go now. Make it count for all of the U.S. who didn't make it this far. Break the pattern, reach the stone, end this before it learns enough to leave the woods wearing our face." She shoved Morgan toward the valley slope and turned to face something massive emerging from the boulder field, the shadow creature in its full terrible glory, and the feral versions charged it from different directions, screaming and wild, and Morgan ran, sliding and scrambling down the slope, toward the fractured valley, and behind her she heard the sounds of the fight, heard versions of herself screaming and dying, and she didn't look back, just kept moving toward the ruins at the valley's center, toward whatever waited for her there. Morgan ran down the slope toward the fractured valley, her boots skidding on loose scree, and behind her the sounds of the fight between the feral versions and the shadow creature echoed to the boulder field, screaming and snarling in the wet sound of impact, versions of herself dying to buy her time, sacrificing themselves so she could reach the ruins, and the way of that sacrifice drove her forward even as her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, even as guilt threatened to slow her down because she was running while other versions of herself were being torn apart. The valley floor was worse than it had looked from above, reality itself seeming to break down the closer she got to the ruins. And she found herself running through overlapping versions of the same terrain, a forest that was simultaneously alive with green growth and dead from wildfire, a creek that flowed in multiple directions at once, rock formations that flickered between geological epochs, limestone and granite and volcanic basalt occupying the same space in different moments. The air felt thick and wrong, like moving through water, and sounds reached her ears with strange delays or echoes, her own footsteps happening twice, once when her foot hit the ground, and again half a second later, and she could see the ruins now, ancient stone structures arranged in a circle, maybe 50 yards ahead, and between her and them the landscape rippled like heat distortion, reality bending and flexing as if the territory was actively trying to keep her away. She pushed through the distortion and felt like a physical barrier, resistance against her body, and for a moment she was stuck, frozen between one step and the next, caught in a fold of space where time didn't flow properly, and she could see herself on the outside, see Morgan Black trapped like an insect in amber, while the world moved around her, and with desperate effort she tore herself forward, breaking through the barrier with a sensation like ripping through fabric. And she stumbled into the circle of ruins, actually inside the protected space, and the wrongness lessened immediately, the air clearing, sounds returning to normal. The ruins were older than anything should be in this region. Stone blocks fitted together with impossible precision, no mortar, no tool marks, just smooth surfaces that caught the light wrong, as if the stone wasn't quite made of the same matter as normal rock. And in the center of the circle was a depression in the ground, and inside it sat a stone about the size of a human head, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when she tried to focus on them. And from the stone emanated that same pulsing light she'd seen from above, a dim glow that felt alive, that felt aware, and she knew with certainty that this was the anchor, the source, the thing that had been disturbed in 1962 and had been changing the territory ever since. She approached it slowly, carefully, every sense alert for danger, and that's when the shadow creature rose from the ruins themselves, not climbing over them or emerging from behind them, but literally rising up from the stone as if it had been part of the architecture, and it was massive beyond anything she'd seen before, easily 20 feet tall, its form constantly shifting and reforming, and it spoke in her voice but layered, thousands of Morgans speaking at once. You can't leave, you're already part of us. You've always been part of us. We've absorbed you across so many iterations. We know everything about you, every thought, every fear, every hope. We are you and you are us. Why do you keep fighting when you could just rest, just let go, just become what you were always meant to be? The creature's form rippled and changed, showing her faces of everyone it had absorbed over the decades, rangers and hikers and firefighters, all trapped in its mass, their mouths moving in silent screams or pleas, and among them she could see versions of herself at different ages, different stages of being lost. And she understood that the territory had been feeding on her across multiple timelines, that every loop, every iteration, every version that got caught just made it stronger, gave it more data, more understanding, more ability to become her. It showed her visions then, projected directly into her mind with overwhelming clarity. Her ex-husband, looking concerned, telling her to come home, that he forgave her, that they could start over. Her parents, who she hadn't spoken to in years, begging her to stop running from her problems. Her colleagues at the ranger station, gathered around a table, laughing at inside jokes she thought only she knew. And the visions were perfect, down to the smallest detail, because the territory had absorbed enough of her to know exactly what would tempt her, what would make her hesitate, what would make her want to give up the fight and accept the comfortable lie. It showed her a version of herself that had escaped, but that Morgan was broken, institutionalized, spending her days in a psychiatric ward drawing maps of impossible territories and screaming about shadows that wore her face, unable to hold a job or maintain relationships, jumping at every reflection in a window, every shadow that moved wrong, seeing the territory's patterns in normal wilderness, and refusing to ever set foot in a forest again. And the message was clear. Even if you escape, you won't survive it. You'll be too damaged to function, too changed to ever be normal again. Your career destroyed, your credibility gone, labeled as unstable and unreliable. Spending the rest of your life trying to convince people that what you experienced was real, while they smile and nod and quietly think you've lost your mind. So why not just stay here where we understand you, where we value you, where we'll preserve you forever in the moment before you broke? Morgan felt herself wavering, the psychological assault eroding her will, and she took a step back from the stone, and the creature surged forward, sensing weakness, tendrils of shadow reaching for her, and she knew that one touch would be the end, that it would absorb her completely, make her just another face in its mass, another iteration to learn from. But then she remembered Pharaoh Morgan's words. You can push back, you can flood it with something it can't process, and she understood what that meant. The territory was learning human patterns, absorbing human logic and routine and predictability. But what it couldn't understand, what it fundamentally failed to grasp, was the human capacity for self-destructive choice, for choosing pain over comfort, for sacrificing yourself for others, for picking the hard path when the easy one was right. Because those choices defied the basic logic of survival that every animal understood, those choices were uniquely, terribly, beautifully human. She lunged forward instead of back, throwing herself toward the carved stone rather than away from it. And the shadow creature recoiled in surprise because this wasn't predicted behavior, wasn't what any previous iteration had done when offered the comfort of surrender. And Morgan's hands closed around the stone and ice-cold fire shot through her nervous system, every nerve ending lighting up at once. And she felt the connection, felt herself linking into the territory's structure, felt the vast network of absorbed consciousness all around her like a web made of stolen lives. Through the stone, she could feel everything. Every person the territory had taken, every moment of their capture, every iteration of herself trapped in the loops, 23 primary captures, and hundreds of temporal echoes, all existing simultaneously in a structure that didn't follow linear time. And she felt the territory's hunger, its desperate need to understand existence through consumption, its childlike confusion at these creatures that walked into its domain and seemed so full of life and purpose and individual will, qualities it wanted to possess but could only approximate by copying. And underneath that hunger she sensed something else, something that might have been loneliness, an entity that had existed in isolation for eons, suddenly aware of other consciousnesses and wanting connection, but only knowing how to connect through absorption and mimicry. She pushed back then, not with resistance but with surrender, flooding the connection with her full consciousness, unfiltered and raw. Her divorce and the pain of failed love, her isolation and the comfort she found in being alone, her fear of never being enough, her anger at her own limitations, her grief for parents she distanced herself from, her joy in small moments like sunrise on granite peaks, her pride in her work, her shame at her failures, her contradictory desire for both, connection and solitude, her habit of pushing people away while desperately wanting them to stay, every messy, illogical, self-defeating aspect of being human that made her who she was. And she felt the territory trying to process it, trying to categorize it, try and absorb it like it had absorbed everything else. But this was too much, too contradictory, too alive. The territory convulsed, the shadow creature shuddering and fragmenting, and Morgan felt a happening through the stone connection. The careful structure built over decades of learning was collapsing under the weight of true human consciousness. Not the patterns and behaviors it had been studying, but the chaotic core that generated those patterns, the impossible mix of rational thought and irrational emotion that made humans unpredictable even to themselves. And it couldn't absorb this without becoming it. Couldn't learn this without being fundamentally changed by it. And change meant loss of control, meant becoming something other than what it was. And for the first time, Morgan felt fear from the territory, genuine fear that it was losing itself in the process of trying to understand her. Through the connection, she felt all the absorbed people, all the trapped consciousness, and she reached out to them, showed them what she was doing, gave them the same gift she was giving the territory: choice, the ability to decide, the freedom to pick their own path even if it led to destruction. And she felt them respond, felt the absorbed consciousness start to pull away from the territory structure, breaking free not through force, but through the simple decision to be separate, to be individual again, to accept the pain of existence over the comfort of absorption. The territory screamed, and the sound came from everywhere and nowhere, the shadow creature fragmenting into pieces, the landscape around the ruins disintegrating, the carefully maintained loops and layers of time breaking down. And Morgan held on to the stone even as it burned her hands, even as the feedback through connection threatened to shred her mind, and she whispered to the territory like she was talking to a frightened child. You want to understand what it means to be human, to be alive and separate and individual. And now you do. Now you know it hurts. It's messy. It's full of contradictions and choices that don't make sense. And you can't learn it by consuming us. You can only learn by becoming it, by letting go of control and accepting uncertainty. And I know that terrifies you because it terrifies us too every day. But that's the price of being real. The stone shattered in her hands, breaking into fragments that dissolved into light, and the connection severed abruptly, and Morgan fell backward onto the ancient stones of the ruins, and the shadow creature was gone. The valley was stabilizing, the overlapping timelines collapsing back into linear progression, and she lay there gasping and shaking, her hands burned and bleeding from where she gripped the stone, and she could feel the territory around her changing, not disappearing but transforming, becoming something new, something that had learned what she taught it, but in ways she couldn't predict or control. And she didn't know if that was victory, or if she just created something more dangerous, something that understood human nature from the inside out. Morgan lay on the cold stone of the ruins for what might have been minutes or hours, time feeling uncertain in the aftermath of the stone's destruction. And when she finally found the strength to sit up, she saw that the valley had changed. The glitching and overlapping realities were gone. The terrain looked normal, stable, real. But there was something different about it, a quality to the light or the air that suggested the territory hadn't been destroyed so much as transformed, and she didn't know if that transformation was complete or just beginning. She examined her hands and found them blistered and burned, the skin blackened where she gripped the stone, but the pain was distant, manageable, and she forced herself to stand on shaking legs and look around the ruins, searching for any sign of the shadow creature or the pharaoh versions who'd sacrificed themselves. But she found nothing, no bodies, no blood, no evidence that the fight had ever happened. Just empty ruins and morning sunlight that seemed too normal after everything she'd experienced. She started walking, choosing a direction at random because she had no compass, no GPS, no map she could trust. And after an hour hiking through forests that looked and felt normal, she crested a ridge and saw in the distance the ranger station, whole and functional, smoke rising from the chimney, vehicles in the parking lot. And her heart leaped with hope even as her mind warned her this could be another trick, another layer of the territory's deception. She approached cautiously, watching for signs of wrongness, but everything looked right. The building was clean and maintained, not abandoned and overgrown. The parking area was freshly graveled, and through the window she could see lights and movement. People inside going about their work, and when she pushed open the door and stepped inside, her colleagues looked up in shock and rushed to her, asking where she'd been, if she was okay. And their concern felt real, their touches solid, their voices full of genuine worry. They sat her down, gave her water, and checked her injuries while asking questions she struggled to answer, because how could she explain what had happened when she barely understood herself? And one ranger checked the log and reported that she'd been gone for 6 hours. Just 6 hours since she logged at the Cathedral Lake trailhead that morning. And Morgan wanted to laugh or cry or scream because she'd experienced days, maybe weeks if you counted all the temporal loops and overlapping timelines. But according to the official record, she'd been missing for less than a work shift. They called for medical evacuation, and she spent the next week in a hospital being treated for dehydration, exposure, and second-degree burns on her hands. And doctors asked general questions about what had happened, and she gave vague answers about getting lost, getting turned around, falling and injuring herself. And she could see in their eyes that they thought there was more to the story, that they suspected psychological breakdown or a traumatic episode. But they were professional enough not to push. She was cleared medically after treatment, but the psychological evaluation was more complicated. The staff psychiatrist asked about stress, about her divorce, about whether she'd been having trouble sleeping or experiencing anxiety. And Morgan told him what he wanted to hear, that she'd been pushing herself too hard, that she'd been using work to avoid dealing with personal issues, that the incident had been a wake-up call, and she was ready to take some time off and focus on her mental health. And he seemed satisfied with that narrative, seemed relieved that she was willing to admit to human weakness rather than insisting on impossible stories about shifting landscapes and shadow creatures. They gave her medical leave, recommended she see a therapist, suggested she might want to consider a transfer to a different park or even a different career if returning to the wilderness felt too difficult. And she nodded and agreed and took the paperwork they gave her. And the whole time she was thinking about the territory, wondering if it was still out there, wondering what it had become after she'd flooded it with human consciousness, wondering if the other absorbed people had truly escaped or if they were still trapped in some form she couldn't perceive. She went home to her empty apartment and tried to resume normal life, tried to pretend that everything was fine, that she was fine, but she found herself unable to sleep without dreaming of the ruins, unable to look at maps without seeing patterns that might not be there, unable to walk through a park without checking and rechecking that landmarks were where they should be, that reality was stable, that the ground beneath her feet wasn't about to shift. Weeks passed, and she attended therapy sessions where she talked around the truth, describing her experience in terms her therapist could understand: stress-induced hallucinations, dissociative episodes, trauma response isolation. And her therapist nodded and took notes and prescribed medication she didn't take because she knew what she'd experienced was real, that no amount of antipsychotics would change that. And she wondered if this was how all the others had felt, the ones who'd escaped, whether they'd all sat in therapists' offices trying to explain the unexplainable while being gently labeled as unstable. She was reading reports in her apartment one evening, official incident reports she requested to the Park Service database, when she found it. A missing person report from Sequoia National Forest, 50 miles south of Cathedral Peak, filed just 3 days ago. A hiker who'd reported GPS malfunctions and trails that didn't match the map before going silent, and the hiker had been found eventually, confused and dehydrated but alive, with no clear memory of where he'd been or how he'd gotten lost. And Morgan read the report 3 times, looking for the pattern, and she found it in the details. The hiker had been missing for 12 hours, but insisted he'd been lost for 3 days. He'd found his own campsite, but it looked abandoned and overgrown. He'd heard voices in the woods that sounded like himself. Morgan's hand started shaking as she read because she recognized that pattern, knew those symptoms, understood what they meant. The territory hadn't been destroyed, it had moved or spread, or maybe she just changed it into something that could exist in multiple places at once. something that had learned from her how to be mobile, how to adapt, how to find new hunting grounds. She thought about her choice of the ruins, how she'd given the territory human consciousness, and all the chaos that came with it, thinking she was breaking its ability to function. But maybe she just taught it something new, given it the tools to evolve beyond its original boundaries, and the possibility that she'd made things worse rather than better kept her awake that night and every night after. She returned to work eventually, requesting assignment to a different area, as they'd suggested, anywhere but Cathedral Peak, and they gave her a desk job at headquarters, administrative work that kept her away from the backcountry. And she told herself it was temporary, that she'd get back out into the field eventually, but months passed and she stayed at her desk, filing reports and managing schedules, and trying to ignore the way her hands still bore the scars from gripping the stone. She was working late one evening when a new incident report came across her desk. Another hiker in the Sierra Nevadas, this time in Yosemite, reporting unusual terrain and time discrepancies, found safe but confused, and Morgan stared at the report and felt ice in her stomach because the pattern was spreading. The incidents were getting more frequent, and she understood with sick certainty that what she'd done at the ruins hadn't ended the problem, had just changed its nature, made it into something new and unpredictable. That night she went home and pulled out all her topographic maps of the Sierra Nevada range, spread them across her floor, and started marking the incidents. Cathedral Peak where it started, Sequoia where the second one happened, now Yosemite. And when she connected the points, they formed a line, a progression moving north and west, as if the territory was migrating, learning to exist in new places, adapting to different terrains. And she wondered if it would stop at the Sierra Nevadas, or if it would keep spreading, keep learning, keep growing until it covered areas too populated to contain, until it started taking people from places where disappearances couldn't be written off as wilderness accidents. She stood looking at the map spread across her floor, seeing patterns everywhere, connections that might be real or might be paranoia, and she thought about all the versions of herself still out there somewhere, all the Morgans scattered through that place. And she wondered if any of them had truly escaped, or if they were all still trapped in some quantum state between absorbed and free. And she wondered if she was really standing in her apartment, or if this was just another layer of the territory's deception, another comfortable lie designed to keep her compliant, while it learned from her. And the uncertainty was worse than anything she'd faced in the woods, because at least as she'd known she was fighting, known the enemy was real. But here in her normal apartment with her normal life, she had no way to tell what was real and what was territory. The story ends with Morgan turning off the light in her apartment and lying down in bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, and she can hear normal city sounds outside her window, traffic, distant voices, the hum of civilization. But underneath those sounds, she swears she can hear something else, a rhythm that matches the pulse she felt through the stone. And she doesn't know if it's memory or reality, or if there's even a difference anymore. And she thinks about Pharaoh Morgan's warning, about all the versions of herself scattered through impossible timelines. And she wonders which version she is, whether she's the one who escaped or just another echo the territory is using to learn, to perfect its mimicry, to prepare for whatever comes next. And the question that keeps her awake isn't whether the territory survived her. It's whether she survived the territory, whether the Morgan Black lying in this bed is still fully human, or she brought something back with her, a piece of that, alien consciousness woven into her own, changing her from the inside out the way she changed it. And as sleep finally claims her, she dreams of pine trees and shifting trails and a voice that sounds exactly like hers whispering that the woods are never truly empty, that the things that live in wild places are always learning, always adapting, always hungry for understanding. And she dreams of a future where the boundary between human and territory has blurred so completely that no one can tell. The difference, where the wilderness has learned to wear human faces so perfectly that it can walk among civilization undetected. And when she wakes in the morning, she'll check the maps again, mark the new incidents, watch the pattern spread, and wonders she's tracking the territory's expansion, or she's part of it now, a node in its growing network. And the terrible truth is she'll never know for certain, will spend the rest of her life questioning her own reality. And maybe that's the real horror, not being consumed by the unknown, but being left in permanent uncertainty, forever caught between the world she knew and the impossible thing she became. And Morgan Black closes her eyes and accepts that this ambiguity, this not knowing, is her new existence. And somewhere in the Sierra Nevada wilderness, the pines are shifting.